All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I see people are starting to filter in. Welcome to today's second part of our series on climate change in Africa, the role of concentration of markets and the implications of that on food prices. Today, we're joined by Rina Desnayer and Andries du Toit to conclude the series that we're running. Today's focus will be on the supermarketisation of African food systems and what implications this has on our food systems and what responses might look like. We know that food markets across the continent are ultimately failing African consumers with skyrocketing food prices and malnutrition being experienced broadly, with some worrying trends, especially now in the Horn of Africa. And we've also been made aware recently with recent reports from CTA and IPES of production and trading of key commodities being highly concentrated within and across African countries. At a consumer level, this supermarketisation of food retail is shaping household choices, and large supermarket chains are, acting as gatekeepers for smaller suppliers and setting private standards to entrench their power in value chains. That concentration of power ultimately means that shocks like COVID-19 and the climate crisis have cascading effects, which ultimately impact consumers as well as smallholder farmers who are susceptible to climate shocks. So that's a sort of background about the timeliness of this webinar, and we're hoping that you are able to get some good outcomes to inform your work and hopefully identify your role in the responses that are going to be proposed today. So without further ado, I'm just going to introduce our first speaker. Her name is Rina Desnayer. She works for the Center of Competition Regulation and Economic Development, who are our partners in the series that we're running. Her areas of research interest include competition dynamics in the grocery retail sector, food value chains and regional value chains, with a focus on barriers to entry for small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as alternative routes to market and food systems. And so I think without further ado, I will hand over to Rina to get into her presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Malik. And a good morning still, I see. Good morning to all the participants who have joined us for this webinar. And I'm very glad that the African Climate Foundation has invited us to talk about some of our research on the supermarketization of African food systems and some of the implications of the spread of supermarket chains within South Africa, but also across borders into different countries in Africa. So just perhaps to start off with by saying that this webinar forms part of a paper that I'm co-authoring with my colleagues at CRED, Ms. Olwetu Shedi and Tando Vilakazi. And this webinar and our discussions in this webinar will definitely inform and shape this paper, which we will soon release. So thanks. With that, Malik, can I go ahead and start the presentation? Thank you. Great, thank you. I hope everyone can see my screen clearly. So I think it's probably no surprise to this audience, or this is not something new to this audience, but food systems and climate change are intricately linked. On the one hand, we know that the food industry has a substantial impact on climate change. Studies have shown that about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food industries. And within that, you have certain sectors or certain markets that contribute more to climate change than others. And I think the main culprits, which is also something that probably this audience probably knows very well, the main culprits are your red meat industry and your dairy industry. But on the other hand, climate change also impacts on various dimensions of food security. So this is in terms of the more commonly cited and debated dimensions of food security, such as availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability, but also in terms of two other dimensions that have received or that are receiving increasing attention over the last few years, and these are agency and sustainability. Now, let me just talk a little bit about each of them because they directly impact this topic of the role of supermarkets in terms of shaping food value chains in the continent. So with respect to agency, here we're really talking about a situation where individuals or groups of people have some agency or have some ability to exercise a degree of control over their own circumstances. Now, this is in the context of very sort of stark inequalities or inequities in food systems. At various different levels of food value chains, you have powerful players that have considerable power, either in the form of market power as they sell into downstream markets, or in the form of buyer power as they purchase inputs or raw material from primary producers such as farmers. So we're seeing this increasing levels of concentration, which translates to more wide inequalities and inequities within food markets. So agency, when it comes to food security, refers to the ability of individuals or households to sort of counter this. And we can't understand food systems if we don't understand the implications of this kind of widening inequity in various food markets. The last one, sustainability, is of course very much linked to what we're talking about today. It's about understanding the long-term regeneration of food systems and the need to ensure that making sure that the food needs of the current generation do not compromise the food needs of future generation. So climate change undoubtedly impacts all these dimensions of food security. So where do supermarkets come in, right? So supermarkets, we argue in this paper, are absolutely essential for all these dimensions of food security. And why is this the case? Because supermarkets are, in Africa, are either a key route to market in certain countries, or in other countries are a growing route to market. And they often act as gatekeepers, as the last link between suppliers and processors of food to end consumers. So they have a degree of power to shape the development trajectory of many food value chains on the continent. And with regards to sustainability, we've seen lots of commitments and pledges that supermarket chains, both in South Africa and globally, have made in terms of climate change mitigation, the kind of investments that they want to do, the way in which they want to reduce their carbon footprint. And I'm going to talk about these very briefly in the next two slides, but just to highlight that there is a recognition that the food industry has a huge impact on climate change, and large players like supermarkets are taking this into account. However, the thrust of our paper, if you like, is around the fact that while they are making these commitments and pledges to climate change, these pledges and commitments also need to reflect their role as large lead players in ensuring food security. So in ensuring these various dimensions of food security that I've mentioned above, that they play a key role in ensuring that food security, there is food security through these dimensions. And how does this happen? So it's not just about addressing sustainability, but it's also about ensuring that they are competitive food markets throughout the food supply chain, and that these markets are inclusive. So we need to see more diverse food markets at various levels of production, from the farmer level, in fact, even before the farmer level, when we're talking about inputs into farming, right through to production, processing, and distribution. So our big take-home message, and I'm stating it here, and I'm going to come back to it at the end of the presentation, is that we need to urgently engage much more closely with supermarket chains if we are to see a successful food system transformation in Africa, and to deal with these questions of food security, as well as to deal with the impact of climate change on food security. So as I mentioned, the supermarket chains that perhaps we're all familiar with in South Africa have all made some very significant commitments to mitigating climate change. You can find their pledges or their position statements. They're all publicly available. And you'll see a sort of general trend. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll see a general trend of sort of commitments to reducing greenhouse gases within their own direct store networks, but also to improve energy efficiency, to reduce their carbon footprint, to use more renewables, etc. Importantly, though, these commitments have an impact on their entire supply chains. So you'll see, for example, for Woolworth's climate change pledge, it says working closely with suppliers. Similarly, with ShopRite is trying to improve energy efficiency along supply chains. So these commitments and pledges directly impact the suppliers of food and processed food products to these supermarket chains. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute because we need to understand this more holistically in terms of some of the other pressures and challenges that supply chains face when they try to supply supermarkets. So we'll come back to this. And just to highlight, this is not just, of course, the South African supermarket chains. Last year at COP26, we had the top 5 UK supermarkets also making commitments to halve environmental impact of a weekly shop by the end of the decade. And how they plan to do this is through, again, similar things that we've seen by the South African chains to reduce carbon emissions, reduce deforestation, etc. So there are these pledges, there are these sort of big commitments that have been put out there. And I guess a big part of this presentation is understanding what implications that has for the suppliers in these chains. And in the case of international supermarkets or supermarkets outside the continent, this cascades down to the ability of suppliers perhaps located in Africa to meet some of these standards as they supply into these supermarket chains internationally. Maybe let's just take a little step back and talk about this, the title of the presentation, which is around supermarketisation. What do we mean by that in this context? So here we look at supermarketisation as the trend of food sales increasingly going through formal, often large supermarket chains. And this is a sort of diversion or a change from sales of food products through perhaps your wet markets or your independent retailers, and sort of increasingly shifting and moving through these formal supermarket chains. It was predicted, I think, in the early 2000s that we would see this massive increase in the rate of supermarketization in Africa, where we would see global multinational supermarket chains entering, or international supermarket chains entering the African continent and spreading quite quickly. But what's happened in practice is really, it's been slower than what was predicted. And what has happened in practice has really been more a regionalization of African chains in particular areas or in particular parts of the continent. There are also very wide disparities even within regions. So for example, in the Southern African region, you have certain countries like South Africa, where you do have quite a high degree of supermarketization, where a big proportion of food sales is through supermarket chains. But in other countries within the same region, like Tanzania, for example, you don't really have that many formalized supermarket chains. So even within regions, there's a wide disparity. So what have we seen in practice? We've seen in the SADC region, dominated by South African chains. I've listed a few of them there. You're probably all well aware of them. And very few international chains. In fact, Walmart entered the continent through its acquisition of Massmart and has spread to some extent to the region. But aside from that, you don't really have other international chains. And what you see is both the South African chains and Walmart through Game and Massmart spreading not just into other countries, but within South Africa, spreading from urban areas into more peri-urban and rural areas and into township areas. So that has been the trend of supermarketization in the SADC region. Similarly, in East Africa, you have Kenyan chains dominating that space and spreading into the neighboring East African countries. There have been a few closures in recent years, and you only have one big international chain, Carrefour, and you have another African chain from Botswana, Choppies. So the trend of supermarketization has been a little bit different from what was predicted, but nonetheless, there are enormous impacts of the supermarketization that we see and possibly might see growing in the future. I think the impact on consumers is there's some fairly obvious impacts. And the first one, I suppose, is possibly lower prices. And I say possibly because the expectation is that given the large economies of scale and scope and huge procurement, bulk procurement, that this might be transferred in the form of lower prices to consumers. But of course, this is not always the case. We've seen instances where there've been massive price hikes for certain food products. It might not be at the supermarket level, it might have cascaded down, But in any case, it's not always guaranteed that supermarkets deliver the lowest possible price. Then there's some of the other benefits of supermarkets for consumers: variety, choice, consistency, guaranteed standards, and that's important from a food safety and health perspective, and giving consumers a one-stop shop. So a supermarket these days is not just a supermarket. I mean, you can pay your bills, you can do your banking, you can buy your pharmaceuticals at supermarkets. So it provides a one-stop shop offering with a range of ancillary products and services. I think quite importantly for this discussion today is also the fact that supermarkets are able to quite quickly respond to consumer demand. And this is a function of their ability to collect huge amounts of data on consumer trends. So they are in a very good position to understand what consumers want and demand and respond quite quickly to consumer demand. But on the other hand, they can also shape that consumer demand. And I think this is what Malik was talking about a little bit earlier, through strategic placement of certain products on supermarket shelves. I mean, there's a saying that eye level is buy level. You buy what you can see. You're most likely to buy what you can see immediately at your eye level. So this can be challenging. This could be a problem if the kind of products that are displayed at eye level are not necessarily your nutritious or healthy products. I think if I can remember well, back in 2019 or maybe even earlier, Woolworths committed to not displaying sweets and candy and lollipops and the like at their tills, because there's of course a temptation to pick up a chocolate bar as you're paying for your groceries, and that might be something you wouldn't have done if it wasn't right in front of your face. So supermarkets do recognize the role that they play in shaping perhaps consumer demand, and some have actually made changes to the way they do this. So we're concerned about this because it might contribute, or the availability, the ease of availability of very highly processed or overly processed energy-dense foods at supermarkets is contributing to the double burden of malnutrition. So this is the sort of coexistence of undernutrition along with overweight population and obesity, because such food is so easily accessible. So supermarkets most definitely have an impact on consumers. There are positive and negative aspects of it, and supermarkets can play quite a big role in shaping demand for certain types of products. But what a lot of our research has focused on, I think over the last 7 years or so, and where we've done lots of interviews and spoken to many different suppliers in different food value chains, is really the impact of supermarketization on suppliers. What does it mean for someone who's trying to get their product onto a supermarket shelf? And here, again, no surprises, the large supermarket chains govern their value chains or govern the supply chains for food in various ways. So they impose certain standards and requirements, and some of these standards are, of course, good for consumers. You know, they're food safety standards, and these are obviously something that consumers benefit from. And some of these standards are actually demanded by consumers. They pass on their demands through their purchasing patterns to supermarkets, and supermarkets in turn pass that on to their supply chain. But what we focused on, and which, as Malik said, is my area of interest, is how does this affect small and medium-sized enterprises who want to supply either fresh produce or processed food, packaged food onto supermarket shelves. And what we find is that these requirements and standards, of course, put a lot of pressure on suppliers. I mean, I have a little diagram or drawing at the bottom there that shows suppliers have to try and supply at the lowest possible cost. They have to maintain quality and consistency across a huge number of stores belonging to a particular chain. Then they have to meet both public and private standards. So public standards, general food safety standards, but also private standards that the supermarkets may impose individually. They have to produce sufficient volumes. Supermarkets might demand that all their store outlets carry the same products. And of course, that's a complete challenge for SMMEs. By their very nature, they're small. They're not going to be able to produce those volumes. Then they have to constantly innovate and adhere to certain packaging standards that are either mandatory or private packaging standards. So all of this puts a lot of pressure on your small and medium-sized enterprises, and they need to upgrade if they need to get onto supermarket shelves. Our research has showed that they often struggle to do this, and they struggle to meet the requirements of the formal supermarket chains. And this means that the firms that are able to meet these requirements are often the larger firms, your multinational food processors, considerable power themselves. And the implication of this is that food markets are concentrated at various supply levels. You only have the big players, your multinational corporations who can meet these requirements. Compounding this is this issue of buyer power. And here's where really, I suppose, my interest in food systems comes in, given my background in competition economics and formerly working for the Competition Commission of South Africa. I was very interested in understanding how does market power exerted by supermarket chains impact suppliers? And the market power we're talking about here is largely in the form of what's called buyer power. So there's very highly skewed bargaining positions between supermarkets and suppliers, particularly your SMMEs. So supermarkets can really impose various costs and fees and conditions on suppliers, and often the smaller suppliers are not able to mitigate or to countervail those demands. Now, I've got, again, you can see in that little chart at the bottom, these are some of the fees and the costs that suppliers face when they try to supply supermarkets. They have to pay a listing fee in certain cases. They have to wait a very long time before they get payment for their products. So that's not a direct fee, but it does put them in a very precarious cash flow position. Some of these fees are justified. Others are purely because the supermarket chain has a degree of power and they're able to extract certain rents from the value chain. What are the implications? Very similar to what I had on the previous slide with regards to requirements and standards. The implications are that the margins of suppliers are squeezed. They don't have the countervailing power, and that might mean that they're excluded from selling through supermarket chains. Now, this is a problem in areas where supermarket chains are the key routes to market. How do these suppliers get their products to markets? They might have to sell through alternative channels, which might include informal channels. The larger players, again, can fight back on some of these fees. They can cut down the support fees. They can fight back on promotion fees, but smaller players are unable to do that. We've tried to quantify how much might be extracted, and I've got some papers that we've worked on, and we've kind of calculated it can take off up to 10 to 15% of the price that suppliers get. So how does this affect food systems, and why do we really care? Well, it's back to my point about what this means is that only large players who are able to meet these standards, who are able to push back on the negotiations when it comes to terms and conditions of supplying supermarkets, only these large players are able to supply these big supermarket chains. And then we're in a situation where supply chains might be very concentrated. And concentration in and of itself is only a concern if there are possible abuses of the market power that comes around as a result of this concentration. Importantly, for the topic of climate change mitigation, a lack of effective competition or vigorous competition or a lack of competitive rivalry affects innovation and investments needed to mitigate climate change challenges. So if you don't have vigorous or effective competition, the kind of investments in R&D, investments in new technology, in new processes of production might be stifled. As we know, competition spurs on innovation and development. So this is a problem. If we have value chains that are so concentrated, we might not have the dynamism required to mitigate some of the climate change challenges we face. And then also, and I think the last 2 points I have talked about already, about this passing on of some of the costs and risks of the climate change pledges that I've talked about earlier made by the big supermarket chains, the implications of passing that on to suppliers. As we've seen in the previous slides, suppliers are already, particularly smaller ones, are already burdened with numerous requirements as well as various fees and costs. And on top of that, they might have to take on some of the costs and risks of climate change mitigation. When it comes to global supermarkets buying food products from African suppliers, some of this pressure of environmental sustainability might be transferred to suppliers in the global south. And this has implications, you can imagine, for industrialization of these industries, of these various food value chains within the continent. If we don't have adequate access to markets, there might not be an incentive to industrialize or rewards to industrialization in any case. Just a few examples before I wrap up, Malik. There have been interventions in grocery retail markets globally precisely to address this heavy imbalance between big supermarket chains, and in many countries you have 4 or 5 chains that dominate that space. So to address the imbalances between those chains versus their suppliers. In the UK, there was a market inquiry that led to the setting up of a code of practice, a grocery supply code of practice, and with the establishment of a grocery code adjudicator to oversee the workings of this code of practice. The EU more recently has pushed its efforts on legislation dealing with unfair trade practices. Again, very much trying to navigate the negotiations between supermarkets and suppliers, particularly farmers, and to kind of to make sure or to try and reduce the very skewed bargaining position of suppliers with respect to supermarkets. In New Zealand, very recently, in fact, just a few months ago, there was a proposal for a mandatory code of conduct, again, for the similar reasons. And so was the case in Australia a few years ago. So globally, there have been a lot of interventions in grocery retail to deal with this unequal balance, to deal with the very high degrees or high levels of market power at the retail level and implications that has for the rest of the food system. South Africa, we've intervened. The Competition Commission launched a grocery retail market inquiry, which was concluded in 2019. And some of the recommendations that came from that were about opening up the space for independent retailers to participate more effectively. And one of the, I would call it a success of the inquiry, was the voluntary stopping of what's called exclusive leases between your big supermarket chains in shopping malls. So in the past, if there was a Pick and Pay or a ShopRite that was an anchor tenant in a shopping mall, independent retailers were not allowed to locate in the same shopping mall. Of course, this has an implication on participation of SMMEs or specialty stores or single line retailers that want to locate in the same shopping mall, and by implication affects the suppliers that are able to supply to those chains. So you can see it has a ripple effect of blocking. If you block access at the retail level, it affects the entire supply chain. There were some other very important recommendations that were made in this report, taking us back to the agency aspect of food security. And that is around how do you deal with buyer power in South Africa in the case of big food processors that buy inputs from smaller players, but also big retailers or big supermarkets that buy products from suppliers. And in this regard, there's been an amendment to the Competition Act by the introduction of what's called the buyer power provision in order to ensure fair treatment between small and medium-sized enterprise suppliers and historically disadvantaged individuals and large players that buy from them. But I think a point of reflection here is that cases take a lot of time. We've seen cases at the Competition Commission that can take 7 to 10 years for finalization, and you have this prolonged litigation, especially if you've got a new provision in the Act that still needs to be tested. And I think the climate emergency is just that. It's an emergency, and time is definitely not on our side. We need to create more inclusive value chains, more competitive value chains more quickly. So yes, I think this is a positive development in terms of protecting smaller players, but I am concerned about the time something like this might take. There were some other recommendations also very relevant for what we're talking about. Perhaps just to highlight 2 of them. The one is the role that big supermarket chains can play to develop their SMME and HDI suppliers along the value chain. So as I said, supermarkets have access to amazing data, consumer data. They know exactly what consumers want. This kind of information can be used to shape and to help develop their suppliers, help the suppliers build capabilities to meet requirements and standards. And the panel or the market inquiry panel recognized the very powerful role that supermarkets can play in this regard and actually made a recommendation that supplier development programs ought to be strengthened because this will allow for more inclusive value chains. And they also said that we should think about how else to support independent retailers. How do you support informal retailers, your spouser shops, your township retailers, etc.? How do we provide the right kind of incentives? What kind of finance is available for them, etc.? Just to put this into context, the last two recommendations around supply development programs and finance have been taken up in the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan, which was recently signed by the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. So some of these recommendations have gone on to the next stage, and hopefully they'll be implemented, and hopefully that will lead to sort of more diverse supermarket or diverse retail level, and also support to suppliers. I don't think I'll have time to go through interventions in other countries. Just to highlight that South Africa is not the only country thinking about this in Africa. Kenya has some provisions to protect small suppliers to retail stores. And Namibia has certainly been unique in that back in 2016, it came up with what's called the Namibian Retail Charter, which covers both a code of conduct governing the relationship between suppliers and supermarkets, and also supplier development elements, where they have got commitments from some of the supermarkets to actually invest in their suppliers so that they can meet the standards and requirements of the supermarket chain. And this was all in the drive to try and promote their own local industries. So what's our way forward? I mean, well, you know, we've talked about the importance of supermarkets, the role that they play in shaping value chains, and how do we take this forward? And how do we drive the urgency of this message of supermarkets must come to the party in terms of the position they hold as gatekeepers to end consumers? So I think the first important point here is we need competitive, diverse, and inclusive food supply chains if we are to think about ways in which to mitigate the impact of climate change and to ensure food security in Africa. The more diverse, the more competitive your food supply chain is, the more investments that will be made in climate change mitigation production methods and production processes. We've got to engage with the supermarkets to do this. They are sort of key players in this in this puzzle, and they are they are very well positioned to make major changes and to shape various parts of supply chains. So we propose what we're calling a sustainability compact, which is broader than just sustainability. And this is really a compact between supermarkets in Africa and those globally, supermarkets globally dealing with African suppliers. And it's around making commitments to make supply chains more inclusive. So for example, open up your shelf space to SMMEs in a particular area, you know, allow 2 or 3 shelves just to supply locally produced products, and you can monitor how those products have been produced, you know, in ways that are environmentally sustainable and so on. They have to watch their behavior when it comes to suppliers, and this might be done through codes of conduct. If we're not going the formal route through the Competition Act, it can be through voluntary codes of conduct, and they need to actively be engaged in supply development programs to mitigate some of these climate change issues. Work with your suppliers to try and reduce their carbon footprint or to try and increase their energy efficiency. They're very well positioned, we argue, to do that. I'm going to leave it at that, Malik, and we can probably continue the discussions through questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rina. That was so much to unpack and really, really valuable contribution. So thank you so much for all your work in that. I'm not going to attempt to summarize anything. I think you've done a really good job of explaining why this issue needs to be looked at, especially from a climate lens, because I think it often avoids the attention and scrutiny from climate actors that it should be garnering. So maybe if I could just start off with a quick introductory question, and then I'll bring in Andries. And I just wanted to, so you ended the presentation on a relatively positive note about some of the countries that are enforcing some acts, and as well as some of the voluntary standards that supermarkets are imposing on themselves. But I'm just wondering, you know, so you've mentioned how large firms invest a lot to build and secure their positions in food markets. And as you explained, there are measures that we can take to change current systems and meet some of those concentration and power dynamics that we're seeing. But what would you say to responders who might argue that this would discourage further investment by large firms into these countries that have imposed some of these regulations, and may push them to countries where regulations might be or there might be less impetus or pressure to change? Like, you know, you mentioned the Massmart game and Walmart example. Would that push them to find new markets where there are less stringent requirements?
Thanks, Malik. I think that's a really good question, and it's a question that I get asked quite often when I present my work on supermarkets. And in a nutshell, the question is, what's in it for the supermarkets? Why should they bother investing? You know, they've already made huge investments in setting up networks in South Africa and in the other countries that they expand in. Why should they take that step further to invest in supply development programs? Perhaps even if it's mandated or they voluntarily agree to do that, why would they do that? I think the kind of short answer to that is supermarkets need to take a longer term view on the importance of having a competitive supplier base. And for them to invest in their supplier base, the costs of investment have to be, the benefits have to substantially outweigh the cost. And if they don't take a longer term view, especially in the wake of climate change, this might have serious implications for their very own supply chains. So given climate change issues, there's increasing pressure on local food systems. And if they don't diversify their supplies or their source, they might reach a point where one of their suppliers is no longer able to supply, given some of the challenges of climate change in one region. And if they're only reliant on a handful of those suppliers, this might be a problem going forward. So having a diversity of suppliers actually benefits the supermarket. First of all, they can also, they can get them to compete against each other and get a lower price for their products. You can't do that if you're trying to negotiate with a huge player with considerable power themselves. But if you have a diversity of suppliers, you can get better prices. You can possibly mitigate some of these risks that climate change brings by having suppliers located in different regions. So if climate change affects one disproportionately, you have options. But importantly, if you have a supplier base that's also, if you help to develop more local or regional supplier bases, there are efficiencies that come with that. So you can save on logistics and transport costs if you're not reliant on imports, but you've helped develop your own regional or local supplier base. So that helps the supermarkets in terms of their own bottom line, which is what they're interested in. So I think taking that long-term view is going to be very important, and it might mean a short-term profit sacrifice, but in the long term, it can benefit them.
Very clear. Thank you so much, Rina. So just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions into the Q&A box below, and I'll try to get many of them into the conversation as possible. Before we go on, I'm going to introduce Andries du Toit, who is from PLAS, UWC, and his training is in political theory. And discourse analysis. He's done extensive research on the political economy of structural poverty and racialized inequality in a range of contexts in South Africa. Andries, I'm going to pass over to you to pose any questions you have to Rina and make any remarks. Andries is still muted, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, and hi everyone, and thank you, Rina, for a very interesting discussion about an important and pressing issue. I just have two remarks and questions really to make, and maybe the way to begin is to note how much of your discussion focuses on the issue of the considerable buyer power of supermarkets within the value chains that they operate in. And in a way, that is a very important part of the story. And as we know, this is from the literature, this is one of the critical consequences of supermarketization, this increasing degree of market power that accrues to supermarkets. But a lot of what you are talking about here, and a lot of what we know is really about what happens in the formal sector, which in South Africa is also the sector that we know quite a lot about. And one of the interesting things about African agro-food systems is that they often have a very large, quote unquote, informal component. In fact, in many African countries, the very small retail and informal component of the food system is many times larger than the formal retail and supermarket aspect. And what we often see is the existence of agro-food systems that are characterized by very short highly localized value chains, often very socially mediated. In other words, it's not simple arm's distance market contracts, but very much socially embedded, highly seasonal, often quite vulnerable, but often quite inexpensive, able to supply food at very low costs. And also, and this is the thing that's often forgotten about food systems, they're not only there to provide food, but they also create jobs. And in the informal sector in sub-Saharan Africa, less so in South Africa, is absolutely essential to the livelihoods of millions of people. So how should we think about that? And what do we know about the impacts of the supermarketization on African retail networks and systems more broadly, and particularly the impact on the informal sector? And this is really related to a second issue, which is you focus very much on, it's a sort of logical consequence of focusing very much on supermarkets, market power, and their power as governors of buyer-driven value chains. But what gets missed from that picture somewhat is the spatial component. You don't in a way, you can look at food systems and look at what happens in the value chain, but you can also look at food geographies and the crucial way in which supermarkets are shaping food geographies. By food geography, I mean the fact that people buy food in a place, and the kinds of food that's available to you is very much dependent on where you are. And there's a very big difference between an informal food geography and a formal one, and you get mention of food deserts and so on. And it seems to me that there's also significant regulatory questions that arise from that. For example, there are questions about land use planning, questions about zoning, and so on. And it means that local government is also in a position to fundamentally shape this picture. At the moment in South Africa, we're in a situation where local governments look on malls as really positive developments. In fact, I think South Africa has one of the highest numbers of shopping malls. I don't know whether it's per capita or absolute in the world. And it seems to me that there's a missed trick there, that actually we may have considerable powers to create more nourishing local food economies through enlisting the powers that local authorities have and that municipalities have for spatial planning and rezoning. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Great, thanks, Andres. Those are both excellent questions, and I think maybe I'll start with the second one, which is probably a little bit easier than the first one, and that's the spatial component that you raise, and I think that's really important from the South African perspective. I mean, this is something that the Competition Commission, as part of its grocery retail market inquiry, sort of started looking at, but I think they only uncovered the tip of the iceberg in that inquiry, and it was much more in-depth understanding of this in the South African context. But as part of that, one of the things that they looked at, of course, was the implication of the supermarketization on township enterprises, right? So what does it mean when a supermarket moves into a township area? The South African supermarkets have been particularly good at changing their formats to suit the demographic that they're targeting. And you'll know, for example, ShopRite in an affluent suburb will have its Checkers format, but has now introduced, I think, in its USAFE format, something that rivals a spaza shop quite closely in a container. So it's a mobile container that competes directly with an informal spaza shop in a township area. So we're seeing this move of the big supermarket chains into township areas, altering their formats to suit the demography, and that brings with it some of the concerns you've raised in terms of the availability of nutritious food. So you might have, again, your highly processed foods coming into the township economy. So this is something that was kind of parts of it were ventilated in the inquiry, but the inquiry itself was not able to take that much further. And I think there's such a huge hole right there in terms of research that needs to be done on the implications of this, because not just about the availability of nutritious food, but also what it means for the township economy itself in terms of the revenues and made by these supermarket chains being taken out of the township, as opposed to it being circulated within the township when retail is owned by members of the township itself. So this is something that really needs to be looked at, and I don't think, or as far as I know, there aren't that many studies that look at it in the level of detail that's needed, both from the nutrition point of view and as well as implications for the township economy. And this is very, very closely linked to the second point you've made around the role of local government when it comes to zoning and the role of municipalities. And one of the recommendations, in fact, from the retail inquiry by the Commission was municipalities play a very, very big role in terms of zoning certain areas for retail use. And that role shouldn't, as you say, be biased towards big shopping malls, but should also consider the diversity of retailers that operate in a particular space. You know, we need to engage much more with municipalities when they look at these zoning plans that come in. What are they allowing in that space? You know, is it fresh produce sellers? Is it your large players? And what are the implications of that for food availability in that space? So undoubtedly, very big role for municipalities and local government with regards to the geographic component or the spatial component of where retail is located. Then I think the first question, which was a bit more difficult, was that, and it was linked, I guess, to my earlier point of you see great diversity in the rate or levels of supermarketization in different countries, both within a region and across regions in Africa. So yes, some countries you have much higher levels, like in South Africa, and in others, and I gave the example of Tanzania, you have a lot more informal retailers. And what is the impact on them of the supermarketization? So I think even though to a much slower degree, there is still an impact on these informal retailers, also with regards to the suppliers that are able to supply them. So even if they are in the informal sector, often processed foods that they sell come from your big multinationals. There's some must-have brands that need to be stocked in their shelves. You know, I can think about a must-have Coca-Cola brand or something else. So you still have this dynamic where you have concentrated markets supplying products that go through informal markets as well. So again, that point about we need diversity, we need to encourage suppliers of all different sizes and types, and offer them a route to market and provide them access to market, so that we're not kind of held hostage by highly concentrated firms at any different levels of the value chain. But I do agree that the dynamics are very different in certain African countries than they are to South Africa and perhaps a Zambia or a Botswana.
Thank you so much, Rina. And maybe just to note for all the participants, Andries has had a slight family emergency, so he's had to rush off to the hospital, but we wish him all the best and thank him for his participation. So thank you for those answers, Rina, really comprehensive. And maybe just to touch on the last one, I think it goes to a question that's been posed in the Q&A from Maria about this need for diversity of different suppliers. So she's asked, are we seeing that the terms and conditions or standards imposed by supermarkets are even more difficult to meet for sustainably produced food and products? And I think if I can just abuse my role as facilitator to ask, especially in the context of agroecological farming methods that focus on soil health, maybe if I can just add on, what's the role for things like digitization and certification standards for farmers in meeting some of the commercial requirements?
Yeah, great questions, Maria, and a good sort of add-on there, Malik, about the role of digitization in perhaps facilitating this interaction between suppliers and supermarkets. So in terms of, is it even more difficult for producers producing sustainably to supply supermarket chains? It all sort of comes down to, again, this negotiating power of supermarket chains. So the challenge there is by exerting downward pressure on the prices paid to suppliers, that disincentivizes investment in sustainable production methods because margins are really squeezed. So this is again where supermarkets play a big role. You know, they need to consider as part of the negotiation some of the other benefits that sustainably produced products bring in, and kind of try and take that into account in the pricing that they offer to suppliers. And all these terms and conditions and extra charges all play a role in dampening the investment needed to produce sustainably, and it disincentivizes suppliers to do so because they're simply not going to get the return if they invest in such production techniques, if their margins are constantly squeezed. So I think it adds another layer of challenge that suppliers are already facing when they try to supply to supermarket chains. And then moving on to your point about can digitization help in this? And this is kind of where my research is also taking me in terms of how can we, kind of integrate suppliers, particularly small suppliers, more closely in supermarket value chains. And the one way to do that is to create greater transparency about their production processes, such that they can use that as a competitive advantage and say, I'm producing this product with, this much less water usage, or this much less greenhouse gas emissions. And if that is transparent and visible, and importantly, if that's verifiable, then supermarkets are more likely to allow them a margin in order to continue investing in this type of sustainable production. And for that to be verifiable and transparent, it requires traceability across the value chain. And this is where digitization can come in. So we're thinking about, or we're looking at quite simple technologies in which suppliers can upload certifications that they have, statistics on their production techniques, and all of this is visible to the supermarket when it's looking for suppliers, and that provides a competitive edge for those that do invest in sustainable production methods. It can be more sophisticated through blockchain technology, where certifications are verifiable, and this just creates that transparency, if you like, from the production level right until it reaches the supermarket. And in fact, even for the consumer who might be able to scan a barcode and see the exact journey of that product. So I think there is a very strong role for technology and digitization and digitalization, in fact, to link your smaller players to supermarket chains, and that allows us to verify their production processes and so on. And this is something that I've been interested in the last 2 or 3 years, and looking at the different technologies that might be used for this. So thanks for that. I thought that was a really good area of discussion.
Thanks so much, Rena, and thanks for the question, Maria. So we have about 5 minutes left, but I think we'll end off slightly early. I wonder if I can just conclude on one last question about the role you see groups like the African Climate Foundation playing in supporting some of these recommendations that you've made, or opportunities to diversify supplier streams.
Very, very glad you asked that. So I'll take you back to that very last slide I had on the sustainability compact that we sort of envisaging. So if supermarkets are more active in their engagement with suppliers and the development, are more invested in the development of their suppliers through perhaps supply development programs, which is something that we've been advocating for, this is not just a relationship between supermarket chains and their suppliers. It actually takes an entire ecosystem to make this work. So government needs to come in place to offer public infrastructure, for example, testing facilities or laboratories, or good road networks for that matter. And civil society needs to come in place. And organizations such as yourself will be an instrumental part of sort of passing on skills around sustainability or sustainable production processes and kind of latest thinking in that area as part of designing these supplier development programs, and as part of transferring skills between various suppliers, and in kind of discussions between supermarkets and suppliers on the design of these supplier development programs. So I think there is a really big role for something like the African Climate Foundation to play in this regard, because the sustainability aspect has often been left out of the design of these supply development programs in the past. And all the supermarkets have supply development programs, but the extent to which sustainability is in there, I think, is quite limited.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rena. I think we'll conclude it here. We have a lot to digest and take in from what Rena has presented and discussed today. Maybe just a quick reminder, this will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel, so you can feel free to watch it there. Please also keep up to date with us so you can get access to the reports once they're finalized and published, and we can send those out. Also, if you have any questions that that were on your mind but weren't able to get into the conversation in this round, please feel free to email me, and we can see how we can answer some of those questions in follow-up conversations. Again, thank you so much, Rena. Thank you to Andries as well for attending. Thank you to everyone who's jumped on the call, and I hope you've found value in this conversation. And yeah, just a reminder to please sign up to our newsletter if you don't want to miss out on events like this in the future. Okay, let's close it there. Thank you so much again, Rena.
Thanks very much, Malik, and thanks to the ACF.